Good morning and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. This week we're looking at some more overlooked men and women of the Bible, people whose stories are overshadowed by some of the bigger and better known stories of the Bible. Nevertheless, these small stories are important and show us that even the small ways we might serve God are important too. Today we want to look at Josiah. And even though you've probably never heard of him, his story is one of the more significant ones in the Bible. The story really begins with King David and his son King Solomon. When King Solomon's reign ended, the nation erupted into civil war and was split into two nations, the one in the south called Judah and the one in the north called Israel. In the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, the story switches back and forth, following the story of the kings in Judah for a while, and then moving to the kings of Israel for a while, and then back. And for each one, the king is compared to David. If the king was faithful, the Bible describes him as walking in the footsteps of his ancestor David. If the king abandoned God and God's way, the king was described as not walking in the footsteps of his ancestor David. So some kings were good and some were bad. It often seems like there were a lot more bad kings than there were good kings. Finally, along comes Josiah. His ancestry was mixed. His great-grandfather followed David's way of faith, but his grandfather and father, not so much. When Josiah's father died and he took the throne, Josiah was only 8 years old, and right away the difference was clear as he sought to act in the way of David. By the time Josiah was 12, he had embarked upon a campaign to destroy all the altars to Baal throughout the land. And that might sound like enough, but it pales in comparison to what happened next. When Josiah was 26 years old, he instructed the high priest to take the money that had been collected in taxes and begin a restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, seeking to restore the temple to glory. While they were doing that, as they cleaned out a room of the temple treasury, the high priest found a scroll that seemed to be God's law. He showed it to Josiah, whose heart was cut to the quick. Josiah consulted a prophetess named Huldah, who confirmed that this was scripture, and Josiah then read it to all the people, and a great reform of faith happened to the nation. Most biblical scholars today believe that the scroll that the high priest found and Josiah authenticated has turned out to be the book of Deuteronomy, or at least part of Deuteronomy, and it continues as part of our scripture today. And maybe part of what we can learn from Josiah's story is that even when we think we are doing well with following God's way, perhaps there is still room for reform. Perhaps there is still room for greater faithfulness. God has a way of opening our eyes to see the need around us in new ways. God has a way of shaking us out of our complacency and lethargy and calling us to new ways of being, new ways of acting. God has a way of showing up where and when we least expect, and sometimes where it's least comfortable for us too. God has a way of calling us and inviting us to follow. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.